Yeah, welcome everyone. It's really good to see you here for the fourth of our fall workshops for the Transformations Community of Practice. I'm Bruce Goldstein. I'm an associate professor here in the Environmental Design and Environmental Studies program in beautiful Boulder, Colorado at CU Boulder. And directing the NetWeaver Network is a side project I have. It's a learning community for transformative change makers. Like many of you, I'm a sort of a pracademic or a reflective practitioner, which is really lies at the essence of what we're doing as a transformations community of practice. I'm coordinating this effort, working with Ashley Lane, who is directing the show here. And we're here with a bunch of folks, a bunch of students from the Masters of the Environment program here at CU Boulder. So welcome, Master students. We're learning all about systems change this semester. So the Transformations Community of Practice is an effort to continue to build our community of practice of transformations practitioners and academics and pracademics, the whole lot. Over the last 8 years, we've held conferences in Oslo and Stockholm and Dundee and Santiago. And we were going to go to Barcelona. We were going to be there in a few months, but then 2020 happened. So now we're going to do a global virtual conference in June 17th and 18th. And we're about to send a notice out about that to our listserv. And so do drop us, I think we have your email if you registered for this meeting. But if you got someone else's invite, do send Ashley. She's under Transformations. I think her first title here is Transformations. Drop her your email. Oops, I think we have, I'm gonna toss the mute out there. There we go. So send us your email if you don't happen to be on our email list, and we'll tell you all about the conference as well as a lot of other things that we're going to be sponsoring in next year. So this conference is going to be recorded sessions as well as live conversations in 3 different time zones. I bet Yeheas and Deb will be happy to hear about that time zone differential. So we're doing that in association with Future Earth. And so we have a really good interactive platform we're using there. We'll send you more information about that soon. And you can go to our webpage, which is transformationscommunity.org. I think we can put that in chat, which will tell you more about the conference as well as about other things the community is up to. Like we have a Transformations Arts page, a page of our organizational partners. And so if your organization would like to be listed as a partner to the community, again, just drop us an email. We're doing a lot of other things in 2021, more workshops and other virtual events. But we'd also like to be a kind of holding space or a bulletin board for other organizations and their transformations-oriented activities. So if you put us on your mailing list, we can list your activities and your announcements on our events page and announcements page. We'd be very happy to do that. It's all about practice. We're about transformations in practice, about learning useful tools and techniques for being transformations practitioners, while also recognizing there's nothing like a good theory to inform that practice. So yeah, folks, when they come on, could hit their mute. That would be great. I'm hitting a few mute buttons in the background just to keep the background noise down to a minimum. So our workshop today is entitled Embedding Resilience, Adaptation, and Transformation in Interventions for Sustainability. And that spells out the acronym RAPTA. Reminds me of dinosaur days. So it's presented by Deb O'Connell and Yeheas Tadeli Maru, who have so kindly agreed to join us here, despite the fact that in their time zone, it is something like 2 a.m. So I'm very grateful that that they both have agreed to disrupt their sleep patterns. There's a demonstration of resilience in action there. So they're going to be teaching us today about RAPTA and what it is and how it is and how it can be applied. Yep, that mute button sure is handy. We're going to learn how to use RAPTA for quick system description and analysis and how to apply it to challenges like COVID impacts on the food supply, international travel, and that sort of thing. We'll have some breakout discussions and we'll consider some options for future pathways that are emerging from the use of the RAPTA framework and wrap it up with a plenary discussion. So welcome to our Night Owl presenters, and I'm going to hand it over to them to begin.
Hi everyone, I'm Deb. I'll just introduce myself quickly while Yahes is unmuting. Are you unmuting Yahes?
Yes.
I'm Deb O'Connell and Yahes Maru. We like to start all of our meetings in Australia with what we call an acknowledgement of country, which is an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land that we stand on. Everyone in Australia is getting much more comfortable or more familiar with knowing whose land they stand on. And for me today, it's the Ngunnawal country. And so I would like to pay my respects to the fact that they have been such wonderful custodians for the land over many, many, many thousands of years, and pay my respect to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. And I invite you all also to just spend a moment thinking about the owners of your land and who might have been there, who might have walked there before you. So with that, I'll hand over to Yahes.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this workshop. Also, would like to express my thanks to and acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land that I call in to this meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, Australia. And I would like also to ask everybody, if you go to chat function and write your names, your organization, where you are coming from, that would be great as a way of introduction. We might not have time to do an introduction everybody. That would be good if you could jot your name, organization, role that you have, and where you are coming from. That'd be great. Thank you. And I'll hand over to Deb to start the conversation.
I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
I can see it. Yeah.
You can see it. Okay, well, as Bruce introduced, the title of our talk today is around living in disrupted times. And we're going to do it by using a design tool, a design heuristic called RAPTA, but we're only going to talk about the tool at the end. I'm going to start by introducing 2020 to you. What a year it's been. And I want to spend the first couple of minutes of this session casting back. So I know a lot of you haven't put into the chat your names and things, but we really need you to put into the chat for the next few questions. We want you to think about what you value, what things you valued and prioritized at a couple of different points. So I want you to cast your minds back to Christmas Eve 2018. In the place where you live, I want you to remember where you were, what it smelled like, what it felt like, what you heard. Just put yourself back into that place for a moment. And what we'd like you to do in the chat is write down, what are 3 things about that time and that place and that experience that you valued and prioritized? What were you thinking about as your top priority things that you appreciated and valued? If you can write those in the chat. I can't see the chat, so Yahes will have to tell me when there's a few coming through.
Yeah, coming through.
Now I want you to think about New Year's Eve 2020, beginning of this year. I don't know where you were, I was in Southeast Australia, but put yourself back to New Year's Eve. Can you remember what you were doing? Can you remember what your priorities might have been on that evening? What you valued? Put that in the chat. And now I'd like you to place yourself mid-year, maybe here. For us, lockdown was earlier in the year. Don't know whereabouts you all are, but wherever you are, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. What did you value then? What do you value now? Now write that in the chat. It's a thoughtful, reflective start. It's often where we don't start seminars, but I'm going to take you through my own answers because I want it to be a deeply personal reflection right now. Well, Johannes is first going to actually give a quick summary of what you responded with.
So it's coming through, and one of the striking thing is that obviously for the first one question where there is a lot of family, Christmas Eve family, and having gatherings with friends and having fun, open areas and camping and serving family in church, all those things which we consider normal to this particular time of the year. And same thing in New Year in 2020, different in Australia, but from the other places, similar issues. But obviously in the mid of COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of issues around connectivity, loss of connectivity with friends, valuing quite significantly about health, individual health and health of family, and again valuing about the importance of family and connections and the lack of that connection due to the COVID-19. And worrying about a lot of issues about health, about work prospects, and how and when to make a meaningful impact.
Okay, thank you, Hayes. I want you all to bookmark what you heard from Hayes and also what you've read about what you see coming through in the chat line while I share my answers for that with you. Like many of you, we have a house at the coast, and these are actual pictures from 2019 Christmas. My parents were here. I was with my family. My daughter was back from Hobart, back from university, and for us, it was all about the beach. On New Year's Eve, you probably all know about the catastrophic fires that came through. This is the same place, the same town at 7 a.m. on New Year's Day. This picture here with me at the beach on the dog was 7:30 a.m. The year before. That was the bushfire, which ended up coming to within a kilometre of the town and burnt down many of the towns along the way. And when lockdown happened, for me, as well as missing the connection with family, I became quite obsessed with food. In Australia, in Canberra, most of our food is brought in from afar. I planted a veggie garden for the first time in years. We bought a coffee machine. And I was also really grateful because it rained for the first time after the bushfires. And we were very lucky to have very good drive-in facilities for COVID testing right near my home. So my priorities changed, and many of yours changed very dramatically with context. You can have your held values your held values that stay with you for the whole of your life, but the things that you value are very context specific. And I want to start off with that reflective moment, and I want you to bookmark those things that you prioritized, because they will come back up during the rest of the talk. And now I'm going to hand over to Johannes Certainly food supply came up as a really big issue for us during COVID, quite surprisingly in a country like Australia. And Johannes is going to unpack that a little bit more for us now.
Okay, Deb, are you able to drive or you want me to share? To drive the
I'll keep
presentation?
driving it, Johannes.
Okay. So obviously Australia is exports food. We only not sort of an average. We only import about 16% of our food, and that food is not sort of preferences and different things that are available in Australia, but because of those preferences. So, but COVID has exposed the sort of the vulnerability of the long and complex supply chain of food system that we have, even in a land where usually we are able to support the local demands for food. Obviously, the reasons are multiple players, long chains, instantaneous sort of provision of those materials, and with always an attempt to optimize for low cost, high level of efficiency and maximum profit, which leads everything to be produced where it's low cost, then having a very long value food chain. And that's what that does is makes the system quite vulnerable. So we'll have a little bit of an exercise to work on. Again, we will be, for sake of time, we'll be using the chat function, and Deb is going to summarize those ones at the end. I would like you to work individually and think about those 3 questions that I'm going to ask, and we will summarize those ones, and will be part of the inputs that we'll use as a way to discuss the food value chain. What happened to the food supply chain that you have been in or be part of as a result of COVID-19? Reflect COVID-19. Still, we are under COVID-19. There are changes in a variety of systems that we're in. One of them is the food supply chain. What has happened as a result of the COVID-19? What could you see that has changed around the food system that you're in that you could pick up? And the second question, once you've done that, in the chat function, we'll go to the next one. Please participate, because those are very useful for us for having a conversation. And then once you've done that, we'll ask, how do you and other stakeholders responded? What are the sort of individual responses that you had? What measures have been taken in terms of what were the individual responses that you have? And very interesting responses coming through, which all of us have done. Stockpiling. There was quite a lot of panic that had happened, hoarding. And then the next question is, given the current responses, the response that you were part of and others have done, other stakeholders, governments and other stakeholders, the food value chain actors, what change would you like to see in your food supply chain? Given the COVID-19 experience and the fact that COVID-19 might not be the only shock that we face, particularly in pandemics, there has been quite a lot of predictions that the COVID-19 like experience is part of the future that we are in. What would you like to see change in your food supply chain? Okay, and I will give Deb to summarize those as a starting point for us to go into the next slide.
I forgot that when I was sharing my screen, I can't see the chat, so I had to do some quick maneuvering and join again on my phone so that I can see the chat. So I might have missed a couple in the meantime, but the answers to the first question were around stockpiling. More people are buying from grocery stores and making food at home rather than eating out. The importance of migrant users. A lot of people starting to cultivate vegetables at home. Grocery stores getting empty, farmers markets stayed open, some places only mild disruptions, and food supply chains held up remarkably well. Increased food in sharing economy, panic buying, orders online surged, initial disruptions. So that was, I think, the answers to the first question.
Fantastic.
Maybe some of them are the answers to the second question as well, which are how do your stakeholders respond? More cooking at home, people started baking and stores ran out of basic ingredients. My family continued to support the farmers markets, which was an enjoyable shopping experience, and we planted a big garden. Shopped for older neighbours who didn't have to go to the store. Commercial food contracts unable to be fulfilled due to lockdowns. Lots of produce and animals were thrown away. Food delivery services more prominent. Local food, no chemicals. And then what would you like to see change in your food supply chain? Local food, better protection, respect for at-risk workers. Localization of the food system is a big one, local and circular supply. That's probably one of the most common responses, actually. Sensible restrictions to prevent hoarding and panic. I'd like to see the HEROES Act pass in the Senate, in which provisions to help independent food restaurants continue. Greater respect for global interconnectedness, more people growing their own food, shorter supply chains, middlemen to be banished, more compensation for farmers, cut the supply chain, shorten the path from farm to tables. Control on smuggling food to Iran and Afghanistan. And I don't know what Eco-Bow is, but Eco-Bow, maybe that's a US thing. So that's a summary about
Fantastic.
some of the things that we'd like to see changed. And again, please bookmark those, because they will, both of the answers to the last two questions will be things that you want to bring up in your breakout groups later. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So the next slide, Deb, we will obviously some of you might be quite versed in systems thinking, modeling, and practice. Obviously, this complex problems we are better off if we see it from a systems perspective. And usually, an exercise like this, where once we provoke people with some of the questions relevant to the issues that we are discussing, we then go into a systems exercise. First step is that people often stakeholders in a project design trying to understand the problem, they will leap into the cause and effect relationship. And you'll see the step one would be people would write, this is a cause, this is the effect, and this is the cause and this is the effect. And within a short period of time, we then move them. In fact, the cause and effect are not just linear, they are quite connected. And they become messy. We see the connections, although we are taught to think linearly, the connections and loops emerge quite quickly, and then that starts with then moves into other sort of typical patterns that are existing, or the causal loops that might form the feedback loop system and the stock and flow connections. That exercise then allows us trying to see if there are patterns or structures of the system that are driving the behavior. For instance, in the food system that we have reflected when COVID-19 comes, there is the structures reveal quite themselves and the vulnerability of the structure, the long chain, and how that is vulnerable to disruptions, transport, restrictions of movement. Then that allows us to understand what the critical problems are, and an effort to maybe go back to the slide before for that, Deb. An effort to solve that individually, for instance, hoarding might fix the problem quite quickly, but in the long term, if the system is not structurally changed, like for instance, a long value chain, which is quite vulnerable, into a short, probably a lot more redundant. We might have even the long chain, but there has to be a redundancy in terms of the value chains that we have. Then that problem will not be fixed. Hoarding, in fact, could have a significant unintended consequences for people who are vulnerable, who might be left out because they don't have the capacity to do that. Okay, the next one, I will just present to show what all of you have revealed. I mean, most of the value chains that we have are quite long. Obviously, that was as a result of the drive. So we have food productivity that drives local food production. There is a lot of processing, packaging, distribution, retailing, or providing food services that brings about food supply. But there are also imports, food imports. So food demand is satisfied just both by local food production and food imports. The balance between those is different from for different countries to different countries. For instance, in Australia, like I said, there is a strong feedback loop from food demand to local food production, that usually is the dominant one. But even with Australia, there are places where food import is a significant. The food import is a significant loop or a dominant loop in the food production and supply chain. And that balance could have tremendous implication when COVID-19 hits. If you are absolutely reliant on food imports, like I'll show you the next slide, then the impact of, for instance, this one is a Torres Strait Island in Australia, as an indigenous community in the north, up in Queensland. And the food supply system is heavily tilted by importing food from the mainland, but also other places. Indigenous communities used to produce their own food. After years of dependency, a result of the sort of effect of colonization, some of the practice that they had, food production has waned down, and there is a heavy dependence on imports. And so a disruption for transport would mean that the dominant loop, which is food imports, would have significant impact on the food supply and of the population in Torres Strait. So if you were to shift this loop from dominance from an import-based food supply chain to a local food production-based food supply chain, there is a significant shift that needs to happen, which you guys, all of you talked about, invoked by the COVID-19, where you have a shorter food supply chain, which is dependent around local production. The next slide. So what we will do is that Deb is going to lead us to an envisioning exercise. What we usually do after having that exercise, I mean, it doesn't stop on a causal loop diagram. It could go into a systems assessment of that causal loop diagram into processing it to be a systems assessment, which identifies what the critical variables are, what the feedback loops are, stock and flow model, and to understand where the critical thresholds are. That analysis could be done in a longer period of time after doing exercises, but given the time that we have, we would be shifting to having an understanding of a systems understanding of the problem that you are working on. You then develop a vision and values exercise, which Deb is going to lead us, taking the food value chain as a system of interest for our exercise.
Bruce, this is where I'm going to ask you to run that, but I'm just wondering whether people want to screenshot or take a photograph of that food supply chain diagram to help support the discussion later. So if I do that, and are you just about ready to go and share your screen, Bruce?
Yes.
We tried before everybody started, and the link is a little bit slow from here. So Bruce is going to run you through this and there's a link that everybody can have a play with this on their own phone. It's actually augmented reality piece, but we're just going to show you the desktop version to help set the vision for what we're going to do now. It should just go naturally now.
I don't know.
There's no sound coming through, Bruce.
Okay, let's see if I can fix that. You know, maybe that has something to do with the trying to be on two things at once.
That's okay. I can talk you through it. So here's welcome to town, the town called Mount Resilience. Mount Resilience is a coastal town, and it's been a town that in the past has been badly affected by bushfire. It's a fictional town, and it's been designed for resilience. So the houses have been built, and all of the modifications and adaptations have been made for people to live and work happily in this town, even though they know that extreme natural hazards and disruptions and pandemics will occur. They have gone to a different system of managing the land around the outside of the town. So they use cultural burning, which is the way that the Aboriginal people used to manage fuel load in the forest. They are then ringed by sustainable agriculture, which is irrigated, which means that the landscape remains moist as a barrier to fire, and that there is a local food supply chain which provides jobs and a regional economy built around regional foods during the good times, and also is able to supply people with food when there is a disruption to those other food supply chains. The local economy is thriving, and the changes that have been made serve everybody well during the good times, as well as provide some buffer to shock when those sorts of shocks occur. It also means that some of the business models that are a little bit broken in our current world can run differently. So for example, insurance models in Australia are struggling. Australian insurers typically put, these numbers are real now, not fictional, put about 5% of contribution into the global pool of insurance. But before last summer, drew down about 12% from the global pool. So we're not pricing risk very well in Australia, and that was before the last summer that we call Black Summer. So designing a town where all of the assets in the town provide not only thriving and connected communities during the good time, but as a bundle of assets, they provide things like continued insurability for all of us in the future, very much derived not from taking an asset by asset approach to insurance, but by looking at things in a holistic way and in a bundled way, which helps to finance the more expensive build and the changes that had to be made in the first place. So that's a bit of a vision. This is an augmented reality piece which everybody can look at on their phone, and I encourage you all to explore. It was done by Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is ABC, in close cooperation with CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology. And all of the facts and many of the story arcs were written by us to try and capture the story about what things. So we didn't want to show a town that was destroyed, because everybody knows about that. We just need to look at the news. The stories arcs are around what it's like to live in that town now, and then backcasting how it used to be, the changes that have been made, and how it serves people well now in the good times as well as during extreme events. So we're going to use that as a bit of a visioning piece before we go into the next workshop. And Bruce, if you can stop sharing your screen, then we'll go back to mine. The links are there, and everyone can, in the presentation, and everybody can go to the desktop version, which is what Bruce was showing, or preferably the augmented reality version. Do it with your kids. You just need a piece of floor or a table, and you can walk around it, go into it, and explore the features one by one. But in the meantime, this is the vision. So the links are there, and we've got short, smart, local food supply chains that are resilient and sustainable. They work well in the good times and in the bad.
So I think the next exercise I will be having, just before that, I'll introduce a couple of concepts in the RAPTA approach, or the approach that we use, and then we would leap in. Maybe first though, if Deb, if you could take me to 11th, the generic food supply chain, I will emphasize a couple of things there that would help help us in terms of the exercise. Go back one step. Yeah. So this generic food supply chain has two basic loops, which you have emphasized in the next one too. There is one which is food imports, the other one which is a longer chain, because there is freight and storage and what have you. And the local food production also goes through a processing, packaging, distribution, and what have you. And the drivers of those food supply chains that most of us are in, are mainly, we might have differences in terms of other secondary supply chains that we have, and some of them might be dominant in the local, in the places that we are in, but the drivers are efficiency is a significant driver, just-in-time operations, low cost, low margin, high flux, so that there is no much storage space. So it has to work efficiently, and if there is a disruption to the system, it's quite vulnerable. So distance, complexity of the food supply chain, the fact that it's highly dependent on every actor working together. And if there is power imbalance between those actors during a disruption, that could be a significant challenge. For instance, in Australia, the two retailers, Woolworths and Coles, which are dominant in terms of the food supply chain that we have. And they exert significant power in terms of the value chains. If those are quite important variables that affect how food supply chain might work in a normal time, might behave differently in a crisis. So those are very important things to note for the next exercise we have. So if we go to number 15, this slide number 15, I'll just we have, so we did. You are the sort of the participants or stockholders on this work. We then did a systems analysis using a description and then an systems assessment. Now we are going to talk a little bit about what we call broad pathways. Sometimes it's also a systemic theory of change, but this pathways concept is trying to understand the current system, like we did, the food supply chain, and there might be 3 pathways, broader pathways that we need to look into. The first one, if the current system is not working as we like, which we have experienced, for instance, in the food supply chain, we need to ask a few broad set of questions. The first one is there any part of the system that we have, the current food supply chain system that we would like to maintain? And that would be about maintaining the current system, if the current system is functioning during normal times, but also during disruption time. The other question is, if the current system is not providing the values and the visions that we have, and we know also that might not provide the values and the vision that we like to see in the future because of complex set of interruptions, we need then to ask what needs to be modified in the current system to allow us to achieve and fulfill the values and the visions that we have currently, and also in the future, in the likely futures, given a lot of changes that are going to happen. The third one is, well, the current system might not be working now, or is unlikely to work in the future, given some of the changes and disruptions that might come. We then have to ask a set of questions. How is that we need to change the system to provide the values and visions that we like in the likely futures? So we call those ones sort of maintain, modify, or transform. These are broad pathways. So the maintain would be maintaining the current system. There is no much change. Modify, you will adapt it to a certain extent, but it's not radical. The transform is a radical change, and therefore there is steps that we need to take trying to see that system to be transformed. So those are broader concepts that help us understand what this resilience concept is in practice. Resilience is usually considered as an ability to absorb shock and maintain the structure and function of the system. But we know that you could also maintain the system by changing some of the functional structures to provide the values that it has. So the set of changes that need to happen are in a continuum of sort of resilience or maintaining the current system, its in function structure, or modifying it or transforming it. So this whole change that we need like to see in a system is in a continuum. So instead of debating what resilience is, adaptation is, transformation is, those are the set of changes that needs to happen to a system if we are going to drive the value and vision that we would like to see in the future. So there's no need for a sort of theoretical debate where resilience ends, adaptation starts, or how is adaptation or resilience connected. In practice, those are sets of changes that we would like to see if we are going to, if the system is going to continue to deliver values and vision that we like in the likely scenarios. So that interaction would be useful for the next sort of exercise that we'll be doing. So we would like now, Bruce is going to help us in breakout groups. We have, I think, 39 people in the list. Maybe groups of 5, if there is a possibility of people to have a chat. So consider the food system that we have seen before. It has a long chain. It is efficiency driven, and we've seen how a disruption like pandemic COVID-19 pandemic would lead to, the effect that it has. Just having a picture of the food value chain, we would like to ask this set of questions. But Bruce, I would like to ask first whether that's a possibility for having a breakout groups now.
Yes, I have those ready to go.
Excellent. So what we would like you to do in your breakout groups is ask a question: what is the current system looks like, the food value chain look like? What would like to maintain from the current system? What we would like to maintain? What we would like to modify? What we would like to transform? Sometimes you might decide, well, there's nothing to maintain, given this current system is not going to work in the future. We would like to just only modify or transform, or there might be parts of the system that need to be maintained, need to be modified or transformed. And we will be reporting back after 10 minutes. And Deb is going to summarize, and we'll have a conversation. Deb, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can probably do this for 15 minutes, Yahaze, because we've got
Okay.
Yeah, so have a 15-minute breakout group. If anyone wants, before we go into the breakout group, photograph this slide, and I did write in the chat to photograph the two systems diagrams. Should I go back to those briefly before we go into breakout groups so that people can take a screenshot? So screenshot this one. Screenshot this one. So this one. And now we can go into breakout groups till 10 past the hour. Or maybe start 15 minutes is fine. So we've got 10 minutes for a report back and discussion. We thought that what the most simple way for everybody to be able to say what they need to say is to put it in the chat, maintain, write it, modify, transform, either each individual or as a group. Certainly by the time it comes to a recording, you'll get a very good idea of, what the thoughts from the room were. So if people start typing, we can start, maybe Yahaze and I can leave the last couple of minutes to summarize. But if anybody wants to keep very short spoken comments, it would be great to actually hear from people as well, but at the same time as people are putting into the chat line.
Deb, could you say one more time what's the question that we should respond to?
We want to know what it is that you wanted to maintain. So label it, maintain, and then put a list. What it is that you want to modify and list it. What it is that you think needs to be transformed. What parts of the system. So does anyone want to have a go at speaking as well as people writing? I'll pick on someone in my breakout group then, because we had a good list going there. There was 3 people in the room. Do one of you want to speak up? Caroline, Ethan.
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in here. Yeah, so we started off talking about maintain or things that we might be able to maintain in the system. And one of the things that we came out with quality would probably be something that we'd like to maintain, but our talk about maintenance got us into talking about things that probably need to be transformed. And so I'll just talk about one real quick, essentially just the way that people think about their food. A lot of people, including myself, don't know what seasons food is supposed to be grown in, or how it's supposed to be grown. And so perhaps by changing people's understanding of that, you know, it could lead to better choices in grocery stores, people not buying produce out of season, or people not passing on a banana because it's too straight, which I learned is a thing in Australia. You know, just educating people could be a good start to helping with that transformation. And I'll defer to my colleagues if I missed anything there, but.
No, that's great. Do anyone else want to speak up? And then I'll start summarizing what's coming through in the chat line. Someone else to offer? Did anyone have a really different take on it?
Deb, yes, here. I would have liked if Maxwell or Bo could summarize a conversation that we had. There was a very useful conversation around regulation and technology and other aspects. Maxwell or Bo?
I'm doing my best to type some things in chat. So Bo, if you feel like you're able to say it better than I am.
Yeah, I think you got most of the code words in the chat, and I mean it's we talked about this the agility and adaptability also comes down to things like rules and regulation. If we during COVID, many alcohol producers started making hand sanitizer, but sometimes got stuck in regulations. So if we need an agile food system, also the rules for that need to be good but agile. And we talked about sort of this aspect of what can be grown locally, what can be grown regionally, what can be grown high tech. So some things are fit for high tech producing, like vegetables, and can be easily distributed. Some things we need to grow maybe in a more traditional way, but then we need to work on things like better storage to make sure that we don't lose things. So the question is, we discussed a bit back and forth on is it the Amazon model or is it the Victory Garden model that will sustain in the end? So, or maybe it's a combination of all of them. So the future food system maybe should, one of the sense of it would be that it will be more diverse than we have today. I put in on this, I put in a link to a company that makes high-tech produce growing very local. So you can have it in the restaurant. They can grow their produce in a high-tech cabinet. So that sort of combines local growing and high-tech.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic, Bo. We're starting to get some really interesting things on the chat line around maintaining the adaptability. So, for example, distilleries going to sanitizers, but a lot of the other things that need to change, transform the labor wages, modify the regulations, modify culturally appropriate food, maintain global supply chains, which prove resilient, but modify by increasing worker voice, power, health, economy, because COVID's revealed how critical these essential workers are. Somebody said, I can't help noticing there's a very Marxist touch in the recommendations in the transformation model. Transform food deserts into equitable points to access nutrition, enhance connectivity and modularity, transform what kind of food can be grown where you are, indoor warehouses, ability to dispense, empower essential workers, more modular systems. So we're getting a whole lot of features of the system that we'd like to transform. And ideally, if we had a full exercise that we were doing here, what we could do is start to build some of those changes into the sort of conceptual model that Johannes has put here online. But then you would start, this is how all models start, with the conceptual ideas and how people think they need to change to remain functional and deliver value into the future. And then you would be going and getting a whole lot of evidence about, evidence and data, and starting to build quantitative models that you can start to then model scenarios with. So, Hayes, do you want to make any comments on what's come in through the chat line and on the exercise before we go on to the next one?
Yeah, so I think, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting, the core variables that we know drive systems, capacity, connectedness, like institutions, networks, and also technology, have been captured in the conversations. There was a talk about regulation. How do you change to make things agile so that they didn't get stuck? So there was networks around how could you create a network between local, regional, and some basically international. There was discussions about technology. How could you use technology to modify, maintain, modify, or transform? Those are quite useful exercise. And what we would have done in a normal exercise is that, okay, given those options that we came through, we would like to maintain those aspects of the current system because they are going to help us in terms of dealing with uncertainty about the future and delivering values and vision. We'd like to modify these aspects, and obviously, if anything doesn't work, this is how we would like to transform. So we usually ask those set of questions to arrive on those ones. What is the type and extent of change required to achieve the vision and satisfy the value in likely futures? I say in likely futures because there are different futures that we might be in. There is uncertainty about those futures. So there is a scenario exercise that has to be done to do that. Why is each level of change necessary? So you ask the question, is this really necessary? Why is it necessary? How is each level of change going to contribute to the vision and values? And all those being put together, would they be sufficient enough to achieve the vision and values? So then that would help you also if there are gaps that needs to be addressed. And those help us to outline the broad pathways, maintain, modify, and transform. And then we go into depths. What would you then do to actually realize that the pathway, the broad pathway, maintain? And that is where we usually develop options, detailed options. Might be costed, the benefit and cost analyzed, and they get sequenced. And if you might have seen some of the work that's been done, then you would have a roadmap that shows where the pathways might look like and what thresholds or triggers would you have if something doesn't work, where you would be changing to the other pathways. That exercise we didn't put it here because it's a lot more complex. So we'll move to the next slide. I think. Deb, do we have time? If there are a few questions because we have gone through a long list of exercise, a couple of questions, and then we move to the next one. Are there any questions from the exercise that we did, or a couple of questions or comments before we move on to the next?
Yeah, I would like to say I would like to see, well, I guess as we go through, I'll see all the interrelationship between all the levels of changes, the pathways, and because I was looking at it from the side of setting standards as well. And there are some European standards, so that the American standards that are required for these changes to take place. So, given like COVID-19, for instance, lots of people were looking into growing that can fit. I use growing as an example because food is very much needed, just as we are generating lots of waste. So people were looking at growing that can be done in any space, and as well as the end side of things, food that is wasted, transforming it back to some kind of plastic. So I'm just wondering what sort of standards can really put these things in place, and are they visible and viable?
Yeah, that was, I didn't get your name. That was a fantastic point. One of the things that we didn't pick up is that West is a significant feature of the food value, the food supply chain that we have. They said up to 40% of food produce is wasted. A significant issue in terms of resource that's wasted, while we have a lot of people who are undernourished in the world, and Australia alone quite significant. I'm sorry. So West is something that also needs to be addressed through this exercise. We haven't picked it up, which is a very important point. And if we could have a sort of a circular food value food system, food supply chain, which picks up, reduces substantially, prevents food wastage, and also the waste that we would have eventually, we have some waste that puts into a circle sort of system that allows to produce a lot more food. Then that would be also an important part of the exercise that we need to do. So that's an important point. We might need to move. Yeah, go ahead, Deb.
Okay, well, we move on. So normally when we run these sorts of workshops, it would be a 2-day exercise. And after doing something like that, we would start to modify the systems diagram that we have in the workshop to reflect all of the things that people brought up. But we haven't got time. It's quite complex to do that, and you need a systems analyst at each table when you do it. So instead, I'm going to take you through an exercise that we have done in Australia, just to show you what we can do with this approach when we do have more time. Can you all see that slide? Is that sharing?
Yep.
You can see that one?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give you just a little glimpse of some of the work that we've done using all of the same things that we've started to explore just in a very shallow way in this workshop format. We did it in a very deep way in Australia. So a couple of years ago, so 2017, Australia started to realise some of the things that the scientists are trying to tell them. The emergency services sector actually started to realise that the sorts of compounding disasters through climate change, but also other things like pandemics that are coming our way, are completely going to exceed the capacity of emergency services to respond. And they asked us to start working out how we deal with the issue of systemic risk. So at the moment, each organisation has a risk plan, and they look at the risks that are within their remit, within their governance structure, where they have some mandate, and they manage risk on a line-by-line basis with a mitigation for each risk. And of course, with the sorts of fires that you've had in California and the fires that we've had in Australia, as well as the pandemic, as individual events, let alone the fact that they've come at the same time, are enough to really break the emergency response system. So we embarked on a process that we called deconstructing disaster workshops, and we gathered people from across sectors. So not just the emergency services sector, but we had people from food supply chains, waters, electricities, communications, utilities. We had the Red Cross, the Green Cross, advocates for migrants and vulnerable people, the unions. We had everybody in the room, and we ran a series of workshops around Australia, and that's the story that I'm going to tell you now. We designed the process using all of the same tools that we're showing you today, and it now underpins our national policy on disaster risk reduction, resilience and recovery. So people value things in stable times. We've seen that. We took them through this workshop process, which is shown on the left. First of all, setting the ground rules, taking a stock on where we are now, a visioning exercise, understanding what disaster might entail, retracing the steps of vulnerability, reframing assumptions, telling the story. We did all of those things, and we went through coming out of that, we got the story that people value things differently in stable times and in the face of disaster. But actually, the vulnerability to disaster is created by the decisions and choices and trade-offs that are made during the peacetime, during the time of relative stability and prosperity, when we value things like privilege, efficiency and cost minimization of our supply chains over buffer and surplus and redundancy in supply chains. We know that some groups in society have a disproportionate power to codify those sorts of things that are valued into the rules that then promulgate the system through society. But we had a number of very typical system patterns, and we've started to explore some of those in this workshop today. So when we went to the values exercise, so that we're not talking now about held values or foundational values, which are the values that you hold through your whole life, but rather the relational and assigned values, the sorts of things that we asked you at the beginning of this workshop. What things do you value, rather than what are your held core values like justice, for example. And we found that through this series of workshops around the country, what came out very strongly was what we call value tensions. So people, this is a simplification, and we can give you the scientific version of it later, but this is the simple version that we give to people, that people are valuing the little widget, the little V on the slides, that tend to value something in the present compared to the future, tend to value ourselves over others, outcomes for ourselves versus outcomes for others. Mostly, especially when things go wrong, people prioritize blame over accountability and learning. They definitely value the tangible rather than the intangible. They value stability over change, although that is more variable. They value people over the planet. And they value, probably if we did the same exercise in the US compared to Australia, that V on liberties would be much further towards liberties, personal freedoms over regulation. So we had about 15 value tensions, but these are the sorts of ones that came out to the top when we did this exercise with people. And the way that we did that was by bringing them in, asking them what they value in the same way as we did, but instead of just asking you to remember a time, we actually had a catastrophic disaster scenario that had been modeled, and we took them through that in a very in-person simulation sense, which was quite dramatic. We had to have psychologists in the background, and the ethics application alone was about 80 pages, as you can imagine. But we were trying to get people to experience the emotions and the sorts of things that might happen when everything fails, when systems fail around you, in a safe setting before it actually did happen. So the values and the way that they are prioritized, values changes with context, and there are tensions between them. So you might value a thing like a car or a house. Other groups value that car or house differently than you do. For example, a bank or an insurance agent will value that same thing differently, and you value things differently in times of stability versus disruption. These can be codified. The values that society holds as a whole are codified as rules. So we can talk about rules as the rules in use, like cultural norms, practices and habits, and rules in form, like regulations, laws and business plan, that provide some agreed guidance on how to behave. And really we say that you can make a decision, a functional decision, when it lines up with the values, so the things that are prioritized, the rules allow it, and you have enough knowledge to know how to do it. That's when these three things coincide, you can get a functional decision. But what we're finding increasingly is that these three things are pulling apart rather than together. Values are going in a different direction than what our knowledge is telling us might lie ahead, and the rules are no longer fit for purpose. And also that the solutions to many of our problems lie outside of that current coinciding thing. So we might know, for example, that coastal retreat, we don't need any more knowledge to know where sea level rise is going to be. We know that it might happen. We don't know when it will happen, but we know where it will impact. but the rules don't enable people to be able to move, and it's not supported by the economic values for doing that. So when we looking at the values, knowledge and rules, and looking at the systems patterns that people had come up with in the values, we had more than 80 raw diagrams, which were very messy, done by all sorts of different people. And then we put a huge amount of effort into distilling those into a set of typical system patterns. So not quite archetypes, but typical system patterns, each with a narrative. And these patterns could be collapsed into a set of things around provisioning systems. So the sort of thing that we talked about here for production of food, but all sorts of essential goods and services, water, electricity, fuel, etc. Health and capacity to care, information and communication, placement of assets, infrastructure, and people and nature. But we also had a whole lot of very typical patterns around behaviours, social capacities and social processes, and those are listed there. And these things obviously intersect. A lot of the physical models, or the models that people apply in making decisions for evidence-based policy, usually focuses on the hard systems, the systems that are going across that you can more easily go and measure and model. But our argument is that unless we start paying attention to some of the other typical system patterns that happen, which are the ones listed across the top, we're not going to really get different outcomes. All of the leverage actually lies in the blue ones. So we then looked at where were some core dependencies. Of course, it's a very complicated thing to try and do a whole model of, but for the purposes of coming up with narratives to influence communities and stakeholders and policymakers, we came up with 3 core dependencies, which most of the people in this room will know, but is not captured by concepts like triple bottom line, which is where a lot of our governments and decision makers and corporations are still reporting to. Because triple bottom line of environment, people and economy usually are viewed as substitutable. But actually this beautiful illustration from a sculpture that Tone Bjordum did, which was hanging up in the Resilience 2017 conference, shows instead of pillars holding things up or separate pillars that can be substituted, that if these things are hanging suspended from the top, that the earth is at the top, the environment, the next level down is society, and it's the money ball, the economy, that hangs off all of those. And if you start to cut the supports at the top, the whole lot comes crashing down. So we've stylized that into the diagram that you see on the left. And this is how the story goes. It looks complicated, but all the pieces of the story are ones that we've talked through. So people have held values, and they value things differently from each other, but they also value things differently depending on the time and the context. And these values are in tension, and they can shift as the context shifts. The dominant values are codified as rules supported by knowledge, and these drive the cumulative systems, cumulative choices and decisions that form these typical system patterns, most of which are what we call in a vicious cycle. The reinforcements take us in a negative direction, so that it kind of holds together when our supply chains are all optimized for efficiency, for example, holds together even though it's not equally beneficial to everyone, but it's actually the current system that is sowing the seeds of vulnerability, so that when there is some disruption, the whole lot falls apart really quickly. And once it does, once disaster hits, we have some choices. And in the past, it's been very natural. It's a very natural human construct when you've lost and you're suffering grief and trauma to want to restore and replace what was lost as quickly as possible. And that's what we call the doing things the same line. But that pathway really reinforces existing vulnerabilities and even amplifies them. We have come to a situation in the policy world of Australia where we are talking about doing things better, which usually involves some sort of legal inquiry, which usually descends into some of those patterns of blame and culpability rather than accountability and learning. But we have some extra knowledge. We usually fiddle around with a few rules, and we modify, for example, our arrangements around disaster funding, or get people to be better prepared, or do what happens in most communities, try and push down to the most vulnerable. That's your job, to build resilience, and abrogate the government responsibility or the corporate responsibility for actually changing the systems which constrain people's ability to build their own resilience. And so our thesis is that, in fact, if you want to really do things differently and transform, you have to understand values and values shifts. And yet all of the work that's done in disaster is usually about understanding the hazard and the hazard behavior more and more. It's very rarely about unpacking vulnerability. It's very rarely about talking to people about what they value and how what they value will shift with the context. And that needs to be then carried through into the sort of policies and rules and corporate plans and other rules that, as well as the cultural rules and norms that that then are the things that can reconfigure our systems and lead to that goal of functioning economies and connected communities, healthy natural assets that we all want. So this approach now underpins our national policy in Australia as a country. We've moved to doing things differently. It also underpins the national narrative. We need to move beyond doing things better to doing things differently. And it also, as a story spine, is starting to inform. We give people those as story beats, those icons as story beats, and challenge them when they're doing their policy briefings to try and hit all of those story briefs. You know, they don't have to give the academic generic systems narrative that in the way that I've given it to you, but that they provide the illustrative examples, etc., to be able to do that. And if you go to Mount Resilience, if you go to that little link that we gave you earlier where we set the vision, and you click on some of the features of adaptation, you'll see that we've structured the story narratives, the story arcs that sit behind each of those to show, to fit this pattern. So with that, that's an illustration of something that was a policy shift and a national narrative shift, but it was designed using RAPTA. That now we're going to talk about the tool that underpins all of this, and Johannes will talk you through that.
Fantastic. Can you hear me? Thank you, Deb. So I think we ran through a simple exercise today. Usually this takes many days, and also separated in between trying to do some of the work that needs to be done. There are 3 items in that process. So considering you as a sort of the stakeholders of food supply system, we first had a sort of engaging with your emotions, with the interest that you have in the space. And that would be about there are 3 sort of modules here: the people, dialogue, values, and vision, the first one, and then the system analysis, the second one, the options and pathways to action, the third one. So those 3 are fundamental for the RAPTA approach. So we tried through the exercise that we had, we went through those. First was about engaging with you about your values and vision exercise, and then moving into a systems analysis. We didn't do this obviously extensively, but a systems description was what we relied on, and then moved into options and pathways, or a broader pathway that needs to be expanded and elaborated through a series of activities. There are also 2 underlying processes. One is active learning. Obviously, the reason why we engage with a lot of stakeholders, different visions, with different values, with different knowledge systems, under different rules, is trying to understand their perspectives, which helps quite a lot in terms of making a better understanding of the system. Obviously, system is understanding a system takes more than an expert, more than a group of policymakers. So when each one of us have bring parts of the system, how we look at it and put together, that helps quite a lot in terms of the systems analysis that we do. And it becomes an inclusive process which provides legitimacy. So the first exercise was about effective engagement and building legitimacy of the process through engaging with different stakeholders. The second one is about systems understanding to underpin sort of the visioning exercise that we do, and then also the options and pathways that we need to develop the next one. So the last one is about options and pathways that will give us tested pathways for action, and that helps quite a lot in terms of we can't just only rely on one option. There is no one plan to achieve the vision and values that we have in the future, given the lot of uncertainty and disruptions that would happen. You have to design multiple options. You would have sort of triggers and how, when, and how you might change those options going forward as you learn more and conditions change, and the triggers that you put in your pathways tell you to change course. So that the route maps that you develop around those. So the two, active learning and adaptive governance, helps quite a lot in terms of driving the process as you design intervention, whether it's project, program, policy, or initiative. And the adaptive governance then helps you also to modify as you learn more through the system. So the RAPTA approach is really brings different things together. In a sense, there are lots of science behind us about engagement and legitimacy, about systems analysis, and about options and pathways, and puts those together, trying to help design interventions that are fit for addressing complex problems and opportunities. So we move to the next slide. Obviously, we have applied the resilience adaptation pathways and transformation approach, a variety of things. It was first developed in 2016, the first version, and we learned from it quite substantially after applying it in different contexts in developing countries, here in Australia, in Pacific, and then revised it the sort of consistent to the principles that the RAPTA approach does promote, which is about adapting your approach as you learn and as you go along and learn from the application of the approach. So currently, as Deb have described it, has been applied Australia extensively in different projects, which is also helping us quite a lot in terms of refining it further. The next slide. So key messages from us. Deb talked about how values as a fundamental fundamental in terms of driving behavior, and this behavior are important. They change. These values change depending on context and also the disruptions that we are in, and the choices that we make during these times of stability determine how whether we would have a systemic vulnerability that is exposed to effects of disaster. So we then we are no more in a position. We are not always in a stability now. There is a lot of disruptions that are happening. So interventions, whether they are programs, projects, initiatives, investments, policies, no more could be designed without attention to having to consider resilience, adaptation, or transformation, which we categorize as a sort of type and level of change. These are sort of a spectrum of type and level of change, and they are about maintaining the current system if it does work, or parts of it works, modifying if there are parts of it working but not to the extent to provide the values and visions that we would like, or transforming it if it's failing or is likely to fail given incoming disruptions. So attending to those maintain, modify, and transform helps quite a lot in terms of making those concepts quite complex, sometimes contested, to be more practical in terms of designing interventions. And again, there is another expression of this. Often, although there might be some aspects to maintain given the circumstance and the sort of series of shocks and compounding effects of some of the interacting and cascading effects of disruptions that we're seeing, doing the same thing might not work. So we need to be looking either doing better, which also is difficult, particularly if the disruptions are continuing and the system doesn't cope, to doing differently, which is about transforming. Obviously, RAPTA can be used to help design the approach and tailor to any specific context, whether it's developing context, developed countries context, a variety of types of shocks and uncertainties that we feel. So we find it quite helpful in terms of helping stakeholders design a variety of interventions that address complex issues. So RAPTA integrates, again, I'm just going back to the three sort of modules that we saw: people, value, and vision for an effective engagement and legitimacy, a systems approach for a systems understanding of this, the system that we're working on, so that it underpin the options and pathways that we have moving forward. So those are key messages that I have. We will then open it for a conversation. I think we have a few minutes left, and we'll
probably a bit less than 10 minutes, but we've got some time for questions.
Deb, do you want to stop the screen share?
Before I do that, I'll just show you that we'll distribute this, and we've put a slide at the end with a lot of the resources that we've been talking about. So just acknowledging we've presented here the work of so many of our collaborators and colleagues, but there's all the links are there as well. So we'll send that out and people can follow up.
Yeah, we're going to post that on the website too.
Yeah, but basically now we're just here for questions and a closeout.
Yeah, I have a quick question, and I want to see if I can drag Alison Quinlan into the conversation if she's still on the line. I know Alison explicitly uses resilience principles in identifying ways that that resilience can be enhanced in the existing systems. Is this something, Alison? Am I characterizing your work correctly? And is this do you think this is a kind of supplement to this system, a kind of additional lens that can be applied to assess the kinds of preferences that people identify? Alison, am I on the right track?
Hi, thanks, Bruce. Well, thanks for calling me out, and it gives me a chance to say thank you to Deborah and Yahias. I really appreciated this, especially knowing it's the middle of the night there. I can't imagine doing that. So thank you for your time there. And yeah, the principles came up in our breakout group with Bruce, and for me, it's kind of like a touchstone, and I think it's kind of baked in and built into the RAPTA approach that Deborah and Yahias do. It's sort of like the kind of core theory upon which a lot of these tools have been built. And I just make a personal practice of thinking of them explicitly, these 7 resilience principles that are in the Biggs et al. Book, that, again, as a touchstone to come back to, like diversity of the system, again, livelihood diversity, biodiversity, connectivity, modularity, etc., throughout the process of doing something like a systems analysis or a resilience assessment. So I think they're integrated into a lot of different approaches, and maybe I just make a point of being more explicit about them because I find that helpful for myself.
Well, I guess we respond to that in that, of course, we know we know that, and we try as facilitators to. The part we showed you today is very much the participatory engagement side of things. And if I go back to that example around the deconstructing disaster workshop, we did a really good test when we did this. We invited all these people, who were 80 people per workshop from all different sectors. And the very first thing we did, it started off like a usual workshop. We had Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO scientists standing up to them, talking to them about climate change, and then talking to them about risk and hazard, etc. And then we went into the first participatory systems exercise with what makes Australia vulnerable, and got them to do linking on that. When we look at the results from that first exercise, there was no concept, even after they heard the usual talk in the usual way and resilience and adaptation, their worldview hadn't shifted. So for example, the comms people, I was at a comms table, you've got the comms utilities. We used to have 40 towers and 300 engineers. We've got now 5 towers and 2 engineers, and at the push of a button, everybody gets an evacuate message. Don't worry, we've got this. Like literally, even after they've heard the climate change talk, that's what they say. So we let them do that, and then we run a visioning exercise and lift them up, and then we run the catastrophic disaster. Catastrophic, but it's all modelled, all the data, and then we send them home for the night, dangling. And then they come back the next day and we take them back to that systems diagram, and a lot of them scrunched up and started again, but obviously that's when, Alison, they start lecturing us. There's only one road in and one road out here. This 2 towers is ridiculous. None of the both towers are broken, and none of the engineers can get to work because our fuel rules only allow emergency services to get vehicles filled up, and these engineers are not emergency services. And so that's when we then start to list those principles on the front, reframe them as resilience principles. But I can pretty much guarantee that unless it comes from them, if we stand up and lecture people about the 7 resilience principles, it would be the same impact as lecturing them about here's what climate change looks like. So we work in that way, where we always try and get the experiential learning and get them to arrive at that conclusion themselves. And then, like we did here, we come only in with the theory at the end.
If I can intervene yet again, Alison, I know you've worked in a lot of extremely diverse settings and with non-Western communities. How does that resonate with your own practice when you're working with people who don't have that kind of scientific mindset?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it kind of comes back to, again, at the start of this presentation, the importance of context. It's so critical going into any different setting, understanding that context and adapting the approach. And similar to what you just said, Deborah, not, having as a starting point lecturing about something like the principles. Those emerge and you use them and you have them in the back of your mind to be able to provide some analysis when it's important, but it's not, I guess both in everything from, how you would structure a process, the timing of it, etc., to the examples that you would use. I infamously remember using a coral reef example in Tajikistan, and that was a good learning opportunity for me, and that's always stuck with me. But yeah, I think it comes back to context. It's just really important to understand that all of these approaches are not written in stone. They can be adapted to different contexts.
Yeah, there are lots of examples like that, and I think one of the most important way to make those concepts, quite complex concepts, operational is really to start where people are at and build on that. So we had recently an example where we've been asked to help regions in Queensland to think about transitioning to carbon neutral economy. and the government, state governments say that we'll be carbon neutral in 2050. And could you work with those 6 communities to start thinking about transitioning to carbon neutral economy? Obviously, the wisdom of one of our leaders from one university, we started having a conversation about transition to carbon neutral economy using a resilience lens. And most of them reacted vigorously about the idea of them thinking about transitioning to carbon neutral economy, while they have a lot of issues that they're currently focusing and dealing with about unemployment, loss of jobs from sort of some of the fuel industry and what have you. So it became quite quickly political. So we had to start again and saying, where are you at, and what would you like to see in 2030? So that helped quite a lot in terms of then us putting some of the ideas. Planning nowadays is done under a lot of uncertainty. The type of conventional planning process that we have, which just favor economic activities, are no more going to be helpful. So then started slowly introducing some of the concepts of resilience. So I think this is absolutely essential for all of the work that we do. Don't go with predefined things. We could introduce those ones as conversation goes on. There is tight points between the people that we're engaging with.
I think we need a few minutes for Bruce to wrap up at the end. So thanks for your questions. And Yahais and I, our contact details are here. If you want to ask any follow-up questions on email, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming with us. I know it's a bit tricky to run a workshop from afar. And so hopefully it wasn't quite as interactive as it would be if we were all together, but that's not really a possibility. So hopefully you managed to keep along with us on the journey, and maybe we can hand over back to Bruce now. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. You know, that was so rich. And I got a sense of the microcosm, the little bit we did, but also the larger, all the processes and how they work together. Can't wait to dig in further. And we'll have an opportunity to do that, all of us. We'll be posting all the materials, as well as any supporting materials that Deb and Yahais want to share on our website, as well as the video of their presentation. The idea is to kind of create an opportunity for you to use these materials and to dig into them and to put them to work in your own practice. So thank you, Deb and Yahais, especially given that it's 4 a.m. I think right now. So the day is only beginning for you guys. And I just hope you have really strong coffee over there. So we'll be publishing, Deb and Yahais will be contributing an article to our issue of the Social Innovations Journal, where we're going to kind of capture the insights of the 4 workshops that we've presented this fall. I'm really looking forward to that coming together. And also, we're going to also invite other contributors to that journal. There'll be an update to that. It's going to be coming out soon by email. So just wanted to remind you all again about the June 17th, 18th conference on transformation, which you can participate and contribute to. We'll be sending out a reminder about that soon as well. So if you have any way that you'd like to be connected to this community or an event to post on our site, do please contact us at the transformationscommunity.org. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And we're going to be planning some fun things for the spring as well, hopefully in more time zone friendly fashions. And really look forward to seeing you all at those as well. So I hope to see you soon. And thank you to of course, our presenters and Ashley Lane for organizing this event. Thank you, Ashley. So I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.